Welcome to the Beacon House podcast, recorded live in Knoxville, Tennessee.
You know, I really thought Event Horizon was a good movie when I was younger. I really need to have better taste in movies as an adult. What a piece of shit.
I know.
Wait,
It's not a piece of shit.
You don't like Event Horizon?
No, it's an amazing movie, but it does not age well. You were not wrong. We
It's
should have
not-
screened it first.
Does it really?
not.
Okay.
It does not. It aged like milk.
He's not
It was-
wrong.
It was fucking gross. I was watching it and I was just like, ew. Like, I love sci-fi horror, and this was like, I don't know.
You and I remembered
it
all
was
the
like
cool
maybe
stuff,
the
but
fifth
better.
season of American Horror Story is just gross.
Oh, man, I remember liking Event Horizon, but that said, I haven't seen it in a decade.
It's got a really good story.
Does it?
It does.
Does it?
It does.
I don't know. It's like, I have this thing that makes a black hole. Oh, that's cool. And it goes to hell. It's like,
I didn't say it made sense. I said it's a good story. That's totally
and
different.
And what I didn't know was Paul W.S. Anderson, or Paul W.S. Anderson, that directed, and he did, after this movie, the Resident Evil movies. And it makes so much sense
And Alien
now.
versus Predator.
Yeah.
Oh.
It
Mortal
makes so
Kombat.
much sense now. Yeah, he did Mortal Kombat.
Oh, okay.
It makes so much more sense now that it wasn't a good movie. Going back and watching it again, I was like, oh, it's because he still sucked even then.
See, I can't accept that. He doesn't suck. It's a great movie. It's
I will
just,
say, so we've been doing horror movie Monday nights
Right.
at.
Didn't you guys recently do Black Christmas or
We're
whatever?
doing it this Monday.
All right, okay.
Well, I guess technically when this comes out, yes, we've already seen Black Christmas, which
Got it.
I screened and was like, it was the very first slasher film ever
Actually,
made.
it was not, and I'm going to tell you that as we get into this episode. But
Psycho doesn't count. Go ahead.
Nope, not that one. Close though, and that does count, and I'll tell you why. But go on. I've got a lot of
Casey blue screened.
I've got a lot of information to unload on you guys during this episode.
Oh God. Well, anyways, Black Christmas is directed and produced by the guy that did Corky's and A Christmas Story, Bob Clark. So it's a fun movie. Yeah, I blue screen. I don't know what we were talking about. What were we talking about?
How's about we talk about the history of horror movies? Hey,
Oh, we watched Evil Dead after the Evil
Yeah,
Dead
yeah, yeah.
remake, and that one was really fun because afterwards people were like, actually seemed affected by it.
you mean the remake where like where they smash the head on the porcelain toilet and the chainsaw scene at the very end? That Evil Dead remake?
Yeah,
it's incredible.
In 2013,
Fucking amazing.
It bothered Libby.
Amazing.
It like at the end of it, Libby looked at me and went, "Hunter wanted me to tell you that actually scared the shit out of me." And I was
thought
like,
it was
"Good.
incredible.
That means that this horror movie night was effective."
I loved it. I love the Evil Dead remake. So to that point, okay, and we decided we were going to talk about horror movies, and we're getting closer to Halloween, and so we're getting a little more forensic with everything. But do you guys?
I can't wait for next week. By the way, I don't want to spoil it for.
We've got a real surprise coming up. We're going to really dial it up on how we've got an episode actually this year that drops on Halloween. It's going to be a very special episode. So be sure whatever you do, you tune into the Beacon House Halloween episode on Halloween, and we'll get more into that as we move forward. But man, I tell you, you discussed that we're going to do an episode today, and we're going to talk about horror movies. And we do that a lot. We talk about movies and horror movies a lot, and what recently is good. I thought it would be kind of fun to maybe look at the history of horror movies going back. Because I realized, man, like past like the 70s, I don't really know much about horror movies. Like to me, horror is a relatively recent phenomenon, and it certainly didn't just like happen that way.
I can't wait to hear what you've unearthed.
Okay. Well, and again, it's not the most complete list, but I did make a lot of marks and milestones. So before we get into that, do you guys have anything you want to talk about like horror origins?
No, I honestly, I want to pause here for a second and go back to what you just said, because everything that I've Googled and researched has told me that Black Christmas 1974
Right.
was the first slasher that came out 10 days before Texas Chainsaw Massacre,
Okay.
which was also supposed to be cataloged as the first slasher film.
I'm going to jump ahead in my notes a little
Yeah,
bit.
I don't
do it.
mean-
Let's
I don't
just
mean to
start
jump
there.
ahead,
No, it's
but-
fine.
Well,
Start there.
I'm saying my notes go all. Do you guys know how long horror movies have been around?
I mean, for a while.
Literally
'cause
from the beginning.
Diabolique is on the Criterion Channel, and it's technically supposed to be cataloged as one of the first horror movies.
What year?
Diabolique? Hold on.
Yeah. So
It also depends. You have to understand what horror was back in the day too, because a lot of
Yes.
it's silly as fuck to us now.
yes, and it was silly to the people too at the time. It didn't actually get serious horror didn't actually get serious until the early we're talking like 1910, and it got serious because of the rise of expressionism. So we'll get into that.
Yeah, German expressionism.
Yes,
Diabolique,
European.
Diabolique is a French drama mystery. It's actually not even classified as a horror movie, and it was 1955.
Okay, horror actually goes back starting at 1895.
I was going to say.
Over a century ago. Horror movies have been around for over 100 years.
Dude, Edison made movies himself.
So okay, but go into what, and we'll get to that. We'll move through all this stuff, but check this out. What you're talking about, yes, Black Christmas did predate Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and those did glorify the slasher.
Well, it set the tropes.
Right.
Like the...
Right, but and that was like 74, and then a lot of other stuff happened in the 70s, which we'll get to, like Carrie, like the debut of David Cronenberg, which changed all of the horror for the 70s and 80s, and he did a movie I never even heard of called Shivers. Have you heard of that?
No.
Not heard of Shivers. I have watched Brood, and holy shit, that's a weird fucking movie.
We'll get into that, about what he did that changed everything. It was this weird body horror craze. Mm-hmm. And that also gave rise to the popularization of special effects makeup, like Rick Baker and American Werewolf in London and all that kind of stuff. So let's move back. So, actually, the slasher genre started nearly 14 years earlier in 1960. And we'll talk about that here in a minute, how it did. But getting onto that, is there anything else you guys want to talk about? I mean, I know someone assume you want me to run through this crazy timeline here.
No, for me, my origins of horror movies, I mean, as a child, I was petrified of them.
And yours had to have been in the 90s. Like, you had to have first been exposed to horror in the 90s, based on your age.
Yes. In the 90s, I watched old school horror movies, but even those seemed more not funny, but they were more lighthearted than like the early 2000s Texas Chainsaw Massacre.
Yeah.
And like when the Saw movies, when they started getting gross for no reason,
Yeah.
like trying to show you every piece of meat that falls off someone's face.
And that's by the way, that's where my timeline ends, is 2000s to 2010s. With movies like Saw, most people regard that as kind of the end of like good horror.
Well, now it's kind of having a renaissance.
After 2010, there have been some new things, but they're basically saying, again, if you look at this, and a movie that I didn't care for, Blair Witch, is widely regarded as the last great, the last great innovation.
Blair Witch or the Blair Witch Project?
The Blair Witch Project,
Okay.
That one. Yeah,
and the introduction of found footage horror movies is widely regarded as the last great innovation in the horror genre. It was 1999 when that happened. After that, basically they say most horror became extremely formulaic, including all the Saw movies, all the Conjuring movies, every bit of that stuff. And very rarely do you see a truly original horror movie now. But prior to the 90s and going back 100 years, you saw nearly only original horror movies. To a point, but I'll tell you what, before I get into it, you guys want to add anything? I'll give you kind of like a timeline. We could even stop through this and talk about it if you want.
Well, I just wanted to say that for me, horror movies didn't become very popular in my mind until high school. Like even in middle school, my friends would want to watch the coolest horror movie, and I didn't want anything to do with it because my anxiety would go through the roof.
For sure. Same. I actually hated them until
and then I hit
9 or 10.
I hit high school, and then all of a sudden I wanted to go back and watch, and I've watched all the craziest and weirdest horror movies since then.
Like, have you ever watched the Faces of Death movies?
I don't watch gore porn.
Well, I was just gonna say it's reality. Like it's actual people. It's deaths being filmed and documented, like public executions and stuff.
I don't find that scary. That's just gross in my mind.
It's shocking. It's the reason that some people watch horror to begin with is to be shocked and to feel exhilarated. And after somebody's seen a ton of slasher films and a ton of like gore movies and a ton of suspense movies and every psychological thriller, some people, and this is generally the case. I never bought those movies, but my friends had them. And it was the kind of thing where they'd seen everything, and just nothing made them feel exhilarated anymore. And they started to watch stuff like Faces of Death, where you see a guy literally get his arm pulled off by a Jeep and drug around an arena, like in Argentina. And it's like, it's very, very stunning. But I understand that also borders on that kind of borders on like psychologically disturbing. You know what I mean? Like at some point, if you're comfortable watching things like that, that's got to be unhealthy at a point, unless you're just you see the humanity in it. And
for me, I will go watch just about every horror movie that comes out in theaters, whether I have to wait for it to come to streaming services or not.
Sure.
just to find out if there's new ways I can be scared. I don't really try to go further than that.
Extreme. You just want a new version of
A new story, a new take on a different story.
Yeah.
But going from the horror movies I watch now to doing like Eli Roth's Green Inferno or Hostel or like the later iterations of Saw or Faces of Death, at that point, it's just about how many people I can make throw up.
But regardless of how you feel about like the extreme thing of the horror, there's definitely a psychology to people's love for horror movies. And I think that's important. And this sort of explains kind of, it's not just when horror movies came out and why they're good. It's sort of like our history of association with horror movies based on social things that were happening in the world. And I never realized there was that big of a connection until I did a little bit of research on this. So you want to get into it?
Let's
Yeah.
do it.
Check it.
We stop when we get to Universal.
Okay, there's
For sure.
that's the 30s.
Okay,
We're
yeah.
pretty soon coming up. I've got a list. So anyway, turns out horror movies go back over a century. The year 1895. Let's zip back to the 1895. I don't know what was going on in 1895. I don't know who the
You
president
should
was.
put a film reel sound effect in this one.
Yeah, I don't know. I wish I could paint a picture of the world and America at 1895, but I really can't. I feel like maybe it was somewhere near Tombstone, but not really. I see Val Kilmer walk. But anyway, 1895, something very significant happened. The first projected movie ever came out. And the same year, I mean, this is how close associated people are with scary things, horror movies. Same year as the first projected movie, you start to see the first scary images on screen, which was like a decapitation and then some skeletons being made to dance around. And just the idea that you would see it. Nobody had ever seen an animated skeleton, like on screen. And just people told stories and everything was like kind of lore up to this point. And people said, yeah, sometimes the people rise up out of the graves and walk, or the devil can animate a skeleton. But to actually see it, even in a silent movie, like a skeleton moving around, was crazy shocking to people. So 1895, we start to see the first horror images, and they coincided with the first movie. So horror's been there since the beginning. It has been right up front. There's not like horror started like 40 years after movies did. It was there at the very beginning. And in 1896... this is where widely regarded as the first real horror movie ever. A guy named Georges Méliès. Do you know who this is? Georges Méliès was a French illusionist. He was considered the first ever horror director, and he made hundreds of movies. He made like Trip to the Moon. You remember that famous picture of the moon with a rocket sticking out of its eye, and any of those old like black and white illusionist drawings and stuff. Here's what this guy did. He did something that had never been able to done before. With literature or plays, he used special effects for the first time ever. He had very, very primitive visual effects, like where something would disappear and reappear on screen. He did that kind of stuff, and he used that to achieve an effect that nobody could achieve before that. And all of a sudden, horror movies had special effects to make people even further believe whatever they were telling them, and they were truly, truly scared, or at least exhilarated. Horror movies were still kind of campy in like 1896, but typically, that's where it all started. So Google, if you guys get a chance, Google Georges Méliès. That's Melies. Just go to his Wikipedia, and you'll see all kinds of crazy shit. But it was very, very, and it's super like steampunk, and it's super like, it's really, really, really cool. But all the early horror films centered around classic tales like Faust and Christmas Carol, and they had real gothic roots. It was basically about evil and the devil and skeletons and vampires and it was this very gothic thing. And then in 1910, horror all of a sudden became very aggressive. It wasn't kind of just like illusionist stuff anymore. It actually had the intent to psychologically scare people, and that was because of World War I. It was a reaction to all the atrocities of the First World War, and the movies started to reflect that. And in Europe, there was, like you said, the rise of expressionism, and in reaction to World War I, it gave way to an advanced psychological movement in horror movies.
Is this around the time Nosferatu was made?
Close.
A little before.
A little before. You're almost dead on it.
Cabinet of Dr. Caligari.
That's it. That's that's the next thing.
Okay.
Out of this incredible psychological expressionism trend in movies, these are still silent movies. Keep it to that point. Came what's considered the ultimate expressionist masterpiece, The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It changed horror films forever. and it featured stunning visuals for the time, including weird set design and all kinds of visual things. It was just visually stunning, and you can watch it, I think, on Netflix even right now.
Yeah, those things are still stunning. I've not even seen the movie, but
I've seen it.
If you Google it, Casey, just looking at the sets and like the weird shit going on, like,
Yeah, it was the first time that movies really had an extreme set design.
it seemed like a waking nightmare kind of.
It very much was.
Yeah.
And you know what? I've watched part of it, and honestly, I'm embarrassed to say I was kind of bored. And it's a silent film, so I was like, and I just wasn't in the mood for it, But like now, after reading all this about the expressionist movement and stuff, I'm totally going to go back and watch The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, and I'm really going to pay fucking attention to it. I'm going to try to be a big boy and not be a short attention span guy like I always am. But it's considered a masterpiece, and it changed horror forever. That was 1920. Okay, so we're about 24 years into the horror phenomenon now, and the first real big horror undertaking. When that movie came out, it exploded. And then we enter what they consider to be the first golden age of horror. 1923, Universal enters the picture. And we get things like The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Phantom of the Opera.
Phantom of the Opera. That was literally right here on my notes. Hunchback, Phantom. Do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Not even that one, but just to the point I had before about keeping in context like what was horrifying back then. Like you were saying about the skeletons. It plays more adventurous today, and I'm sure still kind of was anyways, but The Lost World in 1925 with Willis O'Brien's dinosaur special effects alone, that was a horror film. And, again, just a different tier. The stuff that you're talking about was the real, like, just get inside your head and fuck with you things. But if you consider that, again, no one had ever really seen that stuff before, and it's one thing to watch a model monster of whatever kind walk by, which was the thrilling aspect of it, but then you got this guy that knows how to somewhat blend it in with a live set that looks like the building down the street from you, and now there's a fucking dinosaur walking over and there's little people running around and it steps on it. Again, not scary by any means today, and probably wasn't the most horrifying thing they'd ever seen before, but you have to keep in mind the fact that this is unknown shit.
They didn't grow up with it.
Yeah.
They'd never been sick. They had there was no Jurassic Park. Like it was the world was different back then. Mm-hmm. And to see something like this on the big screen for the first time was earth-shattering for people. And so you got to kind of put yourself in that moment to really appreciate how groundbreaking all this shit was.
But not always. And I'll save that for when we get to Dracula and shit like that. But go ahead.
Well, that's next.
Okay.
1930s. So 7 years later, after the introduction of the golden age of horror, which is the Universal Studios, now Universal has become rapidly successful because of things like the Phantom of the Opera. And now we're entering talking pictures. So you've got movies with sound in the 30s. And then Universal comes out with two movies that changed everything, Dracula and Frankenstein, that were massive hits. And so now you've got a commercial aspect to movies that somebody can make a movie like this and it's super profitable. So now the industry starts up, and those two movies are considered the foundation of modern horror, Dracula and Frankenstein.
As well they should be. The thing I wanted to say, just to stop on that in regards to those, is again cheesy special effects by today's standards, but they're aided incredibly by black and white and film grain and the poor lighting of everything. So it all reads a lot better than it looks like. But to what you were saying, Casey, where like when you're young, like the old stuff looks kind of silly, so you're more into the new things. I had that, and I would watch these on like Turner Classic Movies with my mom every year, and it was just and she'd go, and you got to keep in mind this was scary at one point, and that was funny and thrilling and shit. And then I got the DVD of Dracula and lost it for a long time, and found it sometime in like high school and put it on because I hadn't seen it in years at that point. And Bela Lugosi's iconic performance is iconic, but the voice is weird and silly and all that shit. And no one's going to say you're wrong about that. But if you just turn the lights off and let that movie tell you the story that it wants to, it's not something that's going to mess you up for the rest of your day or anything. But while you're there, like your skin will crawl, and it's creepy as shit.
I love
like,
that.
The atmosphere of everything is what the directors Carl Laemmle and James Whale and all that. That's what they really used, and it was smart. And I don't know if it was that they saw the defects and everything, or if that was just a style anyways. But those things ooze atmosphere, and it will, for the time that you're watching it, will get under your skin and fuck you up. Credits roll, and then you're totally fine again. But
That's
there's
kinda
something to
how-
say for that.
That's kind of how watching Nosferatu was for me when I did it in high
Sure.
school. Like it was on TV. I think it was probably Turner Classic or AMC. And it was one of those things where it was the first movie I learned to just disconnect myself from reality for like an hour.
Yeah.
Just have that disconnect. Don't realize how cheesy or corny it looks. Just let it tell you the story. And even as a silent film, it was unnerving, especially with the guy with the makeup. I can only imagine what people back then thought of the actor who played Nosferatu, like seeing him out in the street and maybe treating him differently.
Probably
even
did.
back then, to where people treat, actors and celebrities now when they play an actor or character they don't like.
Yeah, and it was, the whole thing was a super big deal. So that was the 30s, and we move into the 40s. The 40s, something real significant happened that kind of started to fragment the horror genre into what we appreciate now. Okay? In the 40s, you started to see the first low-budget horror movies. Because a lot of studios, now notice in the 30s, we had this massive success with Dracula and Frankenstein, and there are a lot of smaller studios that can't afford that kind of a budget, but they want to kind of get in on the game. They want to make their own movies, directors, young directors and stuff. So you had studios come along in the 40s that would supply a very small budget to a director, and they would say, look, we're going to give you like this tiny budget, and we're going to give you the film title, and you just make whatever movie you can about what we say with this much money. And they would literally, this is where you started to see the invention of things like jump scares and suspense and like tension based on weird shots, like not being able to see just out of frame, or somebody like about to open the door and you don't know what's behind it. Like they didn't have that grand like Ben-Hur style movie shooting that Dracula and Frankenstein did, where it was like this massive set with this guy coming down and the lightning. Now they had to rely on things like tricks of the camera and like loud noises coming out of nowhere. And the very first one was 1942 is a movie called The Cat People.
Oh yeah.
And there were other ones too right around that time. And they basically it was very inventive. The directors had to do a lot with a small budget. And so now you started to see movies that were like ferociously inventive and not just like gothic. And so in the 40s, horror movies started to move away from this big gothic blockbuster type style. And then so you had a lot of and also noir was really big in the 40s. Even with like MGM movies, you started to see a lot of like dark, just the movies just seemed darker. So the horror movies kind of did too, and they were much more jump scary and a lot more suspense.
Well, also, I feel like it's funny, even in the 1940s, all the way to today, it seems like the lower the budget of the horror movie, the better it usually is, because they have to be resourceful and they have to be inventive.
Yeah.
Right.
And so they don't have like all this money to lean back on to, soften up or whatever, make things look pretty. And so things like the Blair Witch Project came out, and it was maybe $1,000 to make that movie.
Well, it was a little more. They talked about it in some of the things I watched, but it was definitely one of the most successful horror movies ever, based on how much it cost versus how much it made.
That's like Paranormal Activity. Apparently, it was like $1.1 million to make, and it made $11 million in the first weekend.
Yeah, and in both of those cases, that's a guy that's not just whipping his credit card around. Like you've got a guy a director or somebody that's really having to use his brain to make this thing scary without a lot of fancy bells and whistles. And that's when you start to see, I would say, advanced human creativity, which to me is always the most exciting thing.
Yeah.
Like with music or literature or anything, television. So the next thing that happened is the 50s. And in the 50s, we're starting to see the very first post-atomic age horror. This is after the atomic bomb. This is when people are starting to really fear this is the first time people have widely considered like something might kill us all.
Yeah.
And you have this fatalistic, like kind of a fear, like a general fear of the world over. So horror jumped right on that fucking bandwagon. And you started to see movies about aliens, giant insects, things that have been mutated by atomic energy that are coming to kill you, like the
blob.
Stuff like that. And you started to see also in the 50s a lot of gimmicks because technology was starting to kind of explode a little bit. And so there was like primitive 3D. There was a lot of theaters that had buzzers in the seats.
Yeah.
So sometimes when something would happen on the
Poke
screen,
you in the butt.
it would buzz your ass, and like give everybody a little shock. And it kind of started to get cheesy. That's also the first time you started to kind of see cheese horror in the United States. Interestingly, across the pond in Britain, horror was also kind of taking a turn, but it was in a very opposite way. It was becoming very gruesome. So 1950s European horror almost went back to its Gothic roots.
Yeah.
And got really, really, for the first time, kind of really graphic.
And this is where, correct me if I'm wrong, because I know it follows suit, but I think this is where the origins of what the early Hammer horror films
Yes, it was.
were.
It was, and I didn't write that
50s.
down. That's it. And that
Super R-rated takes on the Mummy.
super
and shit
R-rated
like that.
takes on the Mummy. Yes, and they did a new Frankenstein. I think it was called like the
Curse of
Curse of
something like
Frankenstein,
that.
and it was very graphic, and I think it had an R rating, and it was like real serious imagery. So movies started to get that European horror started to get real serious at that point, and that absolutely opened the door for the next thing, which is what you were talking about at the beginning, the invention of the slasher film and those Hammer films, like you were talking about, which was that was a British film studio, correct?
Yeah.
Okay. And they had movies like that, like the Frankenstein movie. And then all of a sudden the 60s hit, and you have movies with violent and sexual imagery. And that's where the term slasher film came from, or in fact, the year 1960. And there were two movies. One was Psycho. The other was called Peeping Tom. And Peeping Tom was the movie where you very first ever saw what would later become found footage. And it's where this guy was like, he was like a serial killer that would go after these women, but he would film their very last moments. And part of what you would see on the screen was as if you were looking the perspective of through the camera. And so you started seeing people reacting to a camera angle rather than two people reacting to each other.
Sounds like the Poughkeepsie tapes, Casey.
Yeah, like that.
Oh,
but
God.
but the very first one
no.
was in 1960. It was called Peeping Tom, believe it or not. And now you had people that weren't being killed by robots, aliens, vampires, monsters. They were being killed by other people. And it was a woman in a shower. And it was, see what I mean? All of a sudden, it was, like I said, violent and sexual imagery. And that's where the slasher film came from in 1960.
Well, I think, okay, so two things on Psycho. It was the first time that someone had ever advertised a movie with a famous celebrity that died in the first, 5 minutes of the movie and then was never seen again. Another one being Drew Barrymore in Scream. She dies in the first 10 minutes of the movie, then she's never seen again, but she's the face of Scream. She's on the front.
Yeah.
And so in the advertising of Psycho, Alfred Hitchcock put I cannot remember the actress, in the front of the poster and showed her a bunch, and the trailer showed her a bunch, but she dies right away, and then you never see her again. It was just to put asses in the seats.
Yep. Horror became a big business in the 30s. So absolutely, you're starting to see schlocky advertising things like that. Like they're advertising somebody that's not really in the movie much, but just to put butts in seats.
Now, with Peeping Tom and Psycho, did they coin the phrase and term slasher film in that time, or were they still considered mystery movies?
You know what?
Suspense thrillers.
I don't know if they actually said slasher. In the research I did, they said it established the slasher genre, particularly the movie Psycho and the movie Peeping Tom.
But those are retroactive. It's not necessarily untrue for the base level of it, but I would still think...
Because I'm trying to remember in Psycho after... holy shit, I forgot it again.
Janet Leigh, after she goes.
After she goes, how many other people die in Psycho? Or is it just a mystery about trying to figure out Norman Bates?
I feel like don't remember if I've seen it all.
And
the
I've
way
never
through.
seen Peeping Tom, so I don't know that one.
I've never seen Peeping Tom either.
But
Psycho does not have a high body count, though.
But Black Christmas was one of the first movies where people just don't survive.
Like multiple
kills, multiple deaths. And I don't know. I don't know. Like I don't understand. That's one of those murky things. Where
well, I don't know if it is. So I think the distinction's fair. It's kind of. I would argue, since knowing what I know about Black Christmas now from talking to you about it so much over the last week, that probably is the first slasher film. ever. But that doesn't.
But you have Norman Bates killing Janet Leigh in the beginning of Psycho, and that technically is the meaning of slasher film, just like a human killing another human, like knife.
Yeah, but that's a slasher trope. The movie itself isn't structured the way Black Christmas and other ones are. It just has a lot of those elements. So I think it's where you are building the foundation of a thing, and then someone comes over, finds good land, and they go, "This is where we will build our house."
That's totally a good argument. Yeah.
It doesn't discount.
And I've never seen Peeping Tom though, so I don't even know.
That's a good point.
But that's more of the found footage, not found footage, but that's the more of like where the camera angle. Well, I saw clips from it, and it'll be this guy, and he's like in this girl's apartment, and she's like, "What are you doing here?" And he's like got a camera, and he's coming up, and all of a sudden,
that is creepy as fuck.
Well, then the perspective changes, and you're seeing her like through the camera, so you don't see him anymore. You are him, and you're seeing her like scream and react like right in front of you. And that I was like, holy shit!
That's definitely a slasher.
For sure.
Well, and I was like, dude, I can't believe that happened in 1960.
Yeah.
That's crazy. But let's move forward. Another really important thing happened in 1960, and this is maybe even more.
Ooh, can I say it?
Do you know?
I know what it is.
I bet you do. Go.
George Romero's Night of the Living Dead.
You're goddamn right.
1968 specifically.
Which, as funny as it sounds, was actually classified as a sci-fi film because the zombies came to life because an asteroid came from outer space, hit the Earth, and soiled the Earth of like cemeteries.
Which is that's a layover from the 50s when all of a sudden you had things that might kill us all, or shit coming from space, or that atomic age horror.
And Night of the Living Dead was the first time that you saw, what was it? George Romero actually went to a butcher shop and got pig organs and made the actors chew on pig organs, like blood and all, like handed them intestines and livers, and they were like, eat this, chew it, don't swallow it, but just chew it in your mouth and spit it out and make it look as gross as possible.
Wow. Well, it's also considered the beginning of gore in movies.
Yeah,
it's widely. It was they say at the time Night of the Living Dead came out, it was the most graphic thing anybody had ever seen, and it was generally considered where we started to see gore, like actual gross stuff, like you were just talking about, like zombies that rise from the dead and violently killed people, and something else of note happened right at that same time. Rosemary's Baby.
Before we jump to that, because that's going to get us on a whole other tangent. One of my favorites.
I'm ready. Let's go, man.
The thing I wanted to say, I'm glad we got to Night of the Living Dead so quick. I was going to bring that up as an example with the slasher thing. That, bar none, no one can argue, is the origin point and set the standard for what zombies are.
But I don't think they classify them as zombies in that movie.
I don't think they do, and it's not the first time that term had been used in film or even in film to represent The Walking Dead. It was just, it had never been that before. So he takes all these tropes. A thing is a zombie if it dies and then comes back to life, and takes all the weird shit that it was before. And then there's your foundation, and he goes, and this is where I will build, in this case, Night of the Living Dead, as opposed to Black Christmas. And
I also find it interesting that George Romero's Night of the Living Dead, which I'll classify it as that all day, every day. I'll even put as long as possible. But that, I found it interesting when I watched documentaries on that movie that people were leaving the theaters throwing up in that movie back then because they found it that gross.
Yep.
And I watch it now and I'm like, oh, this is mild.
Yeah.
You can tell that it's not that scary, but it was such a well shot film. It's so well written.
Well, and Rosemary's Baby was actually Academy nominated. One of the first ever Academy nominated horror films, and it had all kinds of, it dealt with the occult, and it was absolutely opened the door for a thing like The Exorcist to exist.
The Omen, all that
and
stuff.
The Omen, all down the road. So of those type of movies, The Conjuring, possibly even Rosemary's Baby was sort of like the cornerstone for that particular leg of the horror tree and everything. And then that gets us to the 70s.
Satanic Panic stuff.
Say the 70s is when things get either campy and trashy or super fun. And to me, it's super fun. But some people are going to go, yeah, the 70s is where it all fell apart. But we started to see that's when the slasher genre became popularized, and it was so then we see Black Christmas, we see Texas Chainsaw Massacre, we see Halloween. All of a sudden another movie called Jaws comes in, opens the door to a ton of animal horror movies like grizzly attacks, shark attacks, whatever, animals are going to kill you kind of movies. People were all of a sudden afraid to go in the woods, go in the ocean. 1976, Carrie. Teen horror.
Don't pick on the kid. Don't pick on the weird kid.
1975, David Cronenberg's Shivers. They say launched the body horror craze, which is the fear of like your skin being torn, your head being torn off, being dismembered, something cutting you, killing you. I've never seen Shivers, but Cronenberg is one of my favorites. I'm definitely going to go watch it now. And the body horror craze absolutely overtook the rest of the 70s and the 80s.
And I will say with body horror, speaking of the Evil Dead remake, there is a body horror trope in that.
Bunch.
Oh, no, my favorite one, though. I'm sorry. My favorite body horror, where the girl, the infection's spreading up her arm, and the demon girl's in the basement. She's like, do it, do it, do it, do it. And she's just like, she's like, let it take you over, be evil. And the girl's like, fuck you, and takes a turkey carver and cuts her own arm off.
Yep.
And blood, and it's so much blood that there wouldn't even be that much blood. And it's it's like a bright red, so it looks real campy.
Yes.
But she just tears her arm off, and then the power goes out, and they go and try to find this girl, and she turns around and looks, and it's hanging by a tendon.
Yeah.
Her arm, and then it just goes,
stretches.
and then it just stretches and goes on the ground and drops. And it's one of those things that you watch it, and it's different. I know I at the beginning of this, I talked about how I hated Saw and Hostel and those gore porn movies.
But it was different.
This one was different because it's supposed to be like this dark comedy almost.
Almost, yeah.
It's very slight dark comedy.
It was so extreme that it kind of had like a little bit of rock and roll to it, which kind of made it.
For sure. Yeah.
You could tell that it was so obviously fiction. You know what I mean? That you could kind of get it. It was almost like watching a cartoon or something. Like you're like, okay, I get that. Take me wherever you want.
It's the same thing that makes those Universal monster movies attractive. It's a big theatrical experience.
Yeah.
Come on the ride with me.
And
exactly.
I texted Hunter after we watched Evil Dead Remake, and I was like, because Jane Levy was the main character, Mia, in Evil Dead. She also played in Don't Breathe. Mm-hmm. Both of those movies, she's such a phenomenal horror actress.
Yeah.
I don't understand why she's not in more movies.
I just hope
I think she's in some TV shows.
Yeah.
But when she's sitting there talking to her brother, and like the lamp is turned over and it's just shining on her, and it's after the tree attacked her and she got possessed, and she's looking at him, and she's just like, there's something evil out there, and I think it's in the house with us. And how slow and drawn out she says it to him, and you see like this evil in her eyes.
Yep.
Literally
it's so
breathing the words.
Unfucking comfortable.
Yeah.
Sure.
Like it makes you want to get up out of your seat and just. So
What if she's
totally
in the
agree.
next Texas Chainsaw with that director? You
Is
imagine?
she?
I'm hoping.
Well, speaking of Texas Chainsaw and Halloween, let's talk about what that gave rise to. A little thing I like to call the 80s.
The Scream Queens.
Listen, so in the 80s, building on what had already started with Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween, the popularization of slashers and body horror craze, if you mix all this up, teen horror from Carrie, if you basically take the entire fucking 70s, put it in a blender, and pour it out into a weird neon-colored cup
with sprinkles,
you get Friday the 13th.
I don't know, man.
And it was, the Friday the 13th, it was a clone to the low-budget popularity of like late in the 70s, after all this stuff, there started to become a lot of indie films, a lot of indie horror movies, a lot of weird one-offs, directors, low budget, doing like slasher films.
Sleepaway Camp, 1983, which I feel like was way better than the first Friday the 13th.
I'm sure it was, but all kinds of stuff like that. Friday the 13th intentionally had a low-budget indie kind of a feel to it, because those movies were being shot on a budget. And you'd have to Google what some of these are, late 70s type stuff, but guys are making horror movies for nothing, and they were going huge at the theater. And so...
And this is like, you're talking about practical effects.
Yeah.
Instead of using like CGI and computer stuff, they use like body doubles. They use a bunch of pig's blood. They use pig organs.
And makeup artists like Rick Baker.
Yes.
Guys like that all of a sudden said, hey man, I can make that look like an exploding wound. Like, give me a minute, and we patch it up, and they all of a sudden...
Creepshow.
Tangible effects.
I think is also the 80s.
Yes.
The cockroaches in Creepshow still freak me the fuck out.
Friday the 13th ushered in a new trend of franchise horror movies. Movies with sequels and iconic characters. This is Jason, Freddy, and then Michael Myers. They all of a sudden, he got a bunch of sequels too.
Yeah.
And it was and I understand why some people probably think that that's where horror started to kind of decline, and it wasn't artistic anymore. I think it's exhilarating, but that's when you started to see big studios trying to make indie-looking films and then do a ton of sequels, and then you had Freddy and Freddy and Jason.
Well, because they can make them for $10 a dozen.
Yeah, and then and that was all through the 80s. That's the entire 80s, but. Another interesting thing happened in the 80s, and this is kind of what we were talking about with Faces of Death and stuff. It was a VHS trend of what they called nasty horror.
Yeah.
And it was movies too gross to be in the theater. Weird, like, exploitation movies and stuff, like sometimes real things, whatever, but these went straight to video. And you could get them at your local video store. They were at Blockbuster, and you could rent them if you were over 18 or whatever. So it wasn't like snuff films or anything like that, but just real terrible, like I Spit on Your Grave and movies like that. And so there was a nasty horror. And so now you've got a horror underground, a subgenre of horror, you know, like a subreddit.
Freaks.
Yeah. Of crazy,
No,
gross,
that was before this time.
unrated horror movies that were just awful, that would never, for people that wanted to go outside of, people that had gotten tired of Friday the 13th, and they go, man, this just isn't, they go to the video store, they go to that weird back shelf, and then that's where you found the VHS horror genre.
It's right in front of the bead curtain.
And what's funny is we skipped one thing. I don't know if you guys discussed it in the 1970s, but in 1973 you had The Exorcist. And when it first was launched in theaters, I don't know if many people know this. I don't know if it's an urban legend or not. I believe it's true, is that the director spliced into his film a bunch of real gore and real death, but it was so quickly cut, like it was like flashes, that only your subconscious picked it up. And that's why people were getting so violently ill while watching The Exorcist. And it was such a scary movie because people weren't realizing that they're being tortured with their subconscious, seeing all this gore and violence and like war and shit and superimposed into the film.
I could buy that
I
easily.
don't know. Jury's out on that. I don't have
If
any
it's 1 to 2
information.
frames, then that's gonna. If you're lucky enough, you'll see like a white flash on the screen and not think anything about it, but you still see it. So.
But that's what the Paranormal Activity movies did with every time I went nighttime. If you go back and listen to it, like go back and listen to or watch the Paranormal Activity movies, and wear headphones while you watch it.
That low thing.
When it hits nighttime, there's this low frequency that kicks in, and for some reason, immediately
It's real unsettling.
your heart starts racing, and you don't know why. And it's because they found this frequency that just unnerves people all on its own, and then they add scary stuff on top of it.
Is this the brown sound that Randy?
No,
talks
you don't
about?
shit your pants. It just makes you scared.
Which could lead to you shitting your pants. That's for being
I'm
honest.
gonna punch you in the stomach and make you shit your pants.
Well, look, let's move on to the 90s. So the 80s kind of, basically the 70s sort of capped off every possible horror genre you could think of. The 80s blended it all together and franchised it and made sequels out of it. And then the 1990s, we get into the 90s, horror's kind of worn out. Mm-hmm. Getting into the 90s, horror is almost a parody of itself. People are making fun of horror movies. Now you're starting to see comedy horror movies.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Like, and so now there's a new, in order to still sell people tickets to horror movies, they have to be new and kind of smart. And that's where you see movies like Scream. Scream was about horror movies. It was a horror movie about horror movies. Mm-hmm. And then you started to see like the Friday the 13th, I'm sorry, the Nightmare on Elm Street movie where they were making the movie.
Well, in
A New
81, you
Nightmare.
had Evil
New
Dead.
Nightmare or something like that.
Evil Dead kind of, I feel, ushered in this weird comedy horror.
And so there weren't a whole lot of revelations to horror in the 90s. I remember seeing in the 90s the movies like, I think Stephen King's Graveyard Shift, maybe. And so there were some like...
I feel like the first Scream ushered in a pretty good... I mean,
It did, and it changed horror forever. And there wasn't another revelation until 1999, Blair Witch Project.
which is one of my favorite films,
It's
even
so
though
good.
people
I don't care
hate
for it. I don't personally care for Blair Witch. I hate it because I don't like that
Yeah, I
type
know
of
you
movie.
like Book of Shadows. We
But
get it.
I didn't even really like it, but I thought it was
I
scarier.
love Book of Shadows.
Fuck both of you. It's such a shit movie.
But it was Blair Witch was a game changer because now you had found footage movies, and that was the first time I think you realized it could be like a legit art form, and people really went, and it gave the suspension of disbelief. You felt like you were looking at something real.
Well, it's because they advertise it as real. For the first, back then you didn't really have the internet.
Yeah.
And so when this movie first came out, they actually went and had missing posters made of the actors and actresses in the movie
Weird.
and post them up all over
See, that's
different
fucking
towns.
smart.
And they told they had news channels believing that these kids actually disappeared and that this movie was somehow something you weren't supposed to watch, but they were putting it in the theater so people could be a part of this thing, and maybe hopefully they'll see somebody that they recognize and they can call the police. So when in theaters you first watched the Blair Witch, they even came up and says, if you recognize any of these people, please call the police in this town and let them know. And
Amazing.
they gave a number, and the number was, I believe, fake, and it was part of the movie production crew.
Amazing. And maybe if I knew it was fake before I saw it. People told me, people ruined it for me. Maybe if I would have thought it was real, it would have been a different experience.
And I think that's what sold it, is people thought it was real.
Well, and generally, historically, after Blair Witch, going into the 2000s, they say horror became terribly formulaic, and you don't really see a whole lot of innovation in horror anymore. Sometimes it's done really well. And of course, this is before Ari Aster came along. This is before a lot of James Wan. I don't think
Ty West.
Ari Asshole?
Ty West, one of Ty West's movie, I believe it was Ty
Say
West.
it is.
You're Next.
Oh, no. Yes.
You're Next is a beautiful movie,
Yeah.
and it was like one of his first ones, I believe, outside of VHS, which is also, holy shit,
Didn't
VHS
he do
is
House of the
good.
Devil?
Sure.
Was Ty West?
Yeah, he did House of the Devil.
Fuck.
Well, and then you've got Dennis Widmeyer, who did Starry Eyes and the Pet Sematary remake. I think he's great. So there's obviously room for new innovation. But my question is this, and we're starting to get kind of long here. I know that went by really fast.
Hey, when you talk about horror with me, I'll
Just go.
I'll
Yeah,
talk
yeah,
your
love
ear
it.
off.
I love it, and I love how much you guys know about it and respect the genre going way back. Like I some of that stuff I had never heard of, and it's so impressive to just read that list and hear you guys go, oh yeah, and blah blah blah, like Night of the Living Dead, and you were like Universal 1930, like fuck, you guys really
German
know.
Expressionism.
You dudes know your shit, but
I mean, that's what me and Hunter do. We go into a room and jerk off to horror movies.
How do you think I fucked my hand up?
Halloween movie month. Hunter's like,
Shit.
October's rough for you, bro. But what do you guys think is gonna? What do you guys
Rough
think?
for his dick.
If you had to imagine, we'll close on this. What do you guys think is going to be the next big innovation in horror? What's going to be the next like if I go back and do this in 20 years, what's going to be the next thing on this list?
I think the next thing that's going to be
Where's
on
it
that
gonna
list,
go?
and it's happening right now, and it's something that we can easily talk about, and it's art house horror. I think there's a new genre that's being birthed in horror movies.
Do you think we're going to see it with the Lighthouse?
It's
Yes.
Robert
Yes,
Edgar.
yes.
Edgar? I can't remember his last
Eggers?
name. Egger? No.
As the witch guy, though.
The guy that did The Witch. You have Ari Aster. You have Daniel Whitmire.
Yeah.
These guys are ushering in this new art house horror of slow burn and uncomfortable, not really jump scares, but just making you watch something you feel like you shouldn't be allowed to see.
It's almost like the expressionism movement that they talked about.
Yeah.
The first movies that were designed to make you feel uncomfortable, like World War II, 1920s,
Yes.
Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. It's almost like it's more related to that than it is Texas Chainsaw
It totally
Massacre.
is, and you can see that in the Lighthouse. Obviously, they're not hiding that at all. But that goes to the point. Even watching the preview, it's over the top. The acting's over the top. The lighting's real specific because it's black and white, and it reeks of having set and painted backdrops and everything else.
Yeah.
Which is a good thing. You see all that as a modern audience member, and it looks a little silly, but it reads right. It reads properly. So even though it looks a little silly, you're more kind of like struck by, like we said with Caligari, while you're looking at it, all of a sudden something about it, like you were saying, Casey, is uncomfortable and you don't know what. And I think it's the intentional theatricality of it.
Yeah.
110%. And that as over the top as even the acting is, everyone's owning it and they're not winking at you.
Well, and I think that's why I like art house horror. When we talk about movies
Sure.
like Hereditary, Midsummer, The Witch, a lot of people do not like those movies. And I like it because I feel like I'm watching something new and innovative in the horror genre that I haven't really seen
Sure.
recently. And
And
so
as much as
I'll give it so much the benefit of the doubt just because it's new.
Well, and I even though like I've said a couple times, those aren't necessarily my speed. I think about them a lot, and no matter whether I loved them or not, Hereditary and Midsummer were extremely striking to me, and I was like really freaked out while I was watching them. Like they didn't have necessarily lasting effect. I did think they were a little slow, but I do appreciate them as a genre, and so I'm going to still view that as like to the point of the art and stuff. And I hope it is the next level of horror and the next phase at which we like to
I also think we're gonna
entertain
see-
ourselves by scaring each other.
I also think we're going to see another push of found footage films, and they're going to be better somehow. Like,
That'd be nice. I mean, there's a lot you can do
you
with
have
that.
you have phones that can shoot in 4K now, so I think found footage is going to take a leaps and bounds and come back real strong.
And I think we can't talk about it because it's, private ideas for stuff later. But the things that you and I have talked about and the three of us have talked about for filming, some of your found footage ideas and stuff, it's such an easy way to get started. But the problem, obviously, was that people got started and then rested on their laurels and said, oh, that's weird. Throw some red paint on that. Ooh, spooky. And a bunch of bullshit and didn't think about it. You have ideas for days, pointing at Casey because it's a visual podcast.
Clearly,
Well,
So-
I also have a fucked up mind. I
Well,
think
sure,
some-
but
I
you have a
think
good
weird
heart, and that's
shit.
what matters. So, yeah. But I think found footage would be another fun thing to revisit. But my thing was I thought it was going to go backwards. And that includes everything you were saying, the theatricality, the slow burn shit, the no jump scares, found footage is going backwards. I think it's we've hit the point of no return, so now it's time to look back and take everything that worked from before and then turn it up to 11.
Yeah.
That's what I think we're going to do.
I think so too. And I think that I agree about the found footage films. I think I think we saw the first wave of those. It's the last big innovation in horror, so it hasn't really gotten to develop yet. Like monster movies have been developing since the 30s. They've come a long way.
Yeah.
So imagine what found footage films are going to do in 10 years, 20 years.
Can't wait.
Like, I think that it is going to develop, and it's going to be a thing. So anyway, guys.
Horror movies.
Thanks for talking about horror movies today. I hope everybody appreciated some of this horror history and how smart these two fucking guys are. And I learned a lot about it, too. We encourage you guys to stock up on horror movies this Halloween, do the whole thing, and appreciate it as an art, a real art.
To the note, since you're one to do that, a real quick, it's a small, normal paperback book, and you'll have to buy it used or on Amazon or something, but Stephen King released a book in the 80s, and it's the origins of film like Spencer started for horror going up through the 80s, fiction specifically in movies. It's called Dance Macabre. If you're interested at all in what we talked about and want somebody that's smarter and funnier to kind of hold your hand and take you on the journey, get that book and read it.
I've never read that.
And
I didn't know that's what it was about. I didn't know that's what it was about.
I didn't either. I just got it by chance, and that's what it is.
Badass.
Keep an eye on the Facebook page. I think I'm going to make a nice little list of horror movies people should watch between now and the end of Halloween.
That's a good call.
It might already be on the Facebook before you guys see this, and if it is, go check it out. I'll hopefully have it posted by the time
I'll loan it to you if I can find it.
That's fantastic. And I believe, if I'm not correct, this episode is going to be, you're going to be hearing this on the 24th.
Yeah.
And if it's still before 7 o'clock, you've got a chance to join us tonight at Frightworks.
Ooh.
We're going to go through that mother, and we may or may not make it out.
Ooh, I'm going to bring my camera. I'm going to film you guys.
Let's get...
It'll be my first time doing this, so you better film it.
Guys, come get spooky with Beacon House at Frightworks Haunted House in Knoxville out off Emory Road. Just Google that shit. We're going to be there at 7 o'clock hanging out.
What up? Okay.
I'm gonna close with a line. I'm gonna send us off with a line from a very campy '80s song that came out in 1989 by a band called Dangerous Toys. And they wrote a song about being scared by things in horror movies. And they said, "Hey man, I think I like being scared, and I wish you all were there."
The call's coming from inside the house.